Saturday afternoon here in the coastal suburb of Williamstown, and a local church organist Yossi is preparing the music for tomorrow's morning liturgy. He's the newest in a long line of organists that have served Williamstown Uniting Church since 1850.
So my name is Yossi Mahardika. I'm the official title is All-Age Music Leader here in Williamstown Uniting Church, Australia. So what I do here in Williamstown Uniting Church is I work with the minister to prepare the music for the worship every Sunday, and we also prepare things outside of worship like the youth activities, and also we try to develop the music ministry here in Williamstown Uniting Church, along with the volunteers and also the congregation members. Actually, this is one of my first experience with an actual pipe organ, because earlier I usually play on the electronic organ, and this is like the first few occasions where I get to play the actual pipe organ. And it has been both a privilege and also an honor to play the beautiful instrument here in Williamstown Uniting Church. I think that the organ is such an important instrument, not only in the music but also in the church. I mean, if you hear the sound of an organ playing, it should take your mind straight back to the church. I think that if a church has this kind of instrument, it should be well preserved and it should be played more often.
Constructed in 1893, the organ is one of many built by Australia's most prolific organ builder, George Fincham. Fincham was an organ builder who trained in the UK before moving to colonial Australia in the mid-1800s. Fincham worked alone initially, but would eventually form a partnership with his apprentice Arthur Hobday. Fincham built over 150 organs across the country and is therefore credited as being the grandfather of Australian organ music. Many of his organs have survived till this day and are catalogued by the Organ Historical Trust of Australia, a not-for-profit organisation which oversees hundreds of historical organ instruments just like this one. John Maidment co-founded the organisation in 1977 and is well versed in the organ's history.
My name is John Maidment, and I was born in Camberwell in Victoria, and pipe organs have been an almost lifelong interest of mine. And I guess the first pipe organ that I might have seen was at St Kilda Town Hall. Probably when I was about 8 or 9, we went on a school excursion there, and to see Joan and Betty Rayner, who were performers on the stage, but I was much more interested in the organ that was there on either side of the stage of the hall, and that was an organ built by Fincham and Hobday in 1892, just a few months before the organ in this church was built. This organ was, as I say, built after this period of enormous prosperity. I think between about 1888 and 1894 they'd built about half a dozen 3-manual organs and 1 4-manual organ, so very substantial organs by any standards. And Hobday's contribution to it was very considerable. He designed the casework of these organs, and the organ case here at Williamstown certainly is much more elaborate than what you'd normally find. And also the quality of the organs increased enormously too, because they were in competition with Alfred Fuller in Kew, who used exotic timbers in his organs, especially for the consoles of them. One organ in Bendigo's actually got a console made of satinwood, which is the most incredibly expensive timber, and Fincham's obviously felt they had to raise their game, so they were then making their consoles of Tasmanian blackwood, which you'll find here. The draw stops were beautifully engraved, which you'll find here. And they were even making up cast iron bellows weights for the organs with FH on them, Fincham and Hobday. So these were little touches, but they added enormously to the quality of the organs. Hobday was also doing a lot of the voicing of the organs, that is the adjustment of the organ pipes to produce the desired tonal quality. And this organ is a very fine instrument which represents the ideals of the firm at the time in a very strong manner. And there's some absolutely exquisite stops in this organ. I was trying it earlier, and the harmonic flute on the great organ is absolutely something to die for. Even the gamba on the swell, the string stop, is absolutely wonderful. But the sound here again is wonderfully bright and clear. It's a wonderfully happy, radiant sound. And when we get into the, say, early 20th century, that quality was lost really. They tended to produce organs that were much more foundational in quality, but this one has got really an extraordinarily fine sound.
Whilst the organ is not the biggest of its kind, and is certainly not the oldest, it is likely one of the most well preserved.
Well, I think the most important thing is its originality, because it hasn't really been tinkered with over the years. So many of these organs have been altered and, if not destroyed, they've been improved in inverted commas, and it virtually never works. And apart from one stop on this organ, every other stop is original. And I think that certainly what you hear is what would have been heard in 1893 when this organ was built. So, I mean, I think that's very, very important. But also the organ is freestanding in the building. It's not placed within an organ chamber, which was typical of Anglican churches, where the sound basically is suppressed because it doesn't radiate properly into the building. The sound here escapes into the building very successfully. And also visually, it's very, very pleasing with the beautifully stenciled facade pipes. The touches of gilding on them is immaculate. And also having an individually designed organ case. There's no other organ that's exactly the same as this in appearance. So, I mean, there's a lot of very, very good boxes that you can tick on this one.
Maintaining an organ's functionality whilst maintaining its originality is a difficult balance to achieve. A classic example of this dilemma can be seen in the gold stenciling that Fincham applied to most of his organ pipes. Fincham preferred to use zinc in his constructions because it didn't bend or buckle when cut into such long lengths. Zinc is, however, rather dull in its colour, and so he applied a gold leaf stenciling to most of his pipes to make them more appealing. The gold doesn't rust, but it can tarnish over time. The temptation to repaint these decorations these days is strong, but John says it's best to just leave them alone.
Well, I'd say it's gold leaf that they've used. I mean, it's still very bright and clear. It never oxidises, and there's still a real gleam about them. Of course, the advantage here is that no one's tried to touch them up, and in many cases they'd go down to Mr. McEwen's paint shop down the road and buy a can of gold paint. Well, the gold paint was just brass paint, and of course after 4 or 5 years it would start to oxidise, and certainly a classic example of that is the organ at Auburn Uniting Church, Auburn Methodist Church, where they had beautifully stenciled facades, and then somebody went and got Mr. McEwen's patented gold paint and put over it, and it looks appallingly bad. It's gone brown basically, it looks dreadful. And the advantage here is that no one has touched them, and if you just leave them alone, that's the moral, don't touch it.
Perhaps the only thing as well preserved as the organ is the history of the church surrounding it. At the end of a few hallways is the so-called history room. Here, church historian Michelle has been keeping records on the congregation's stories, which can be traced back to the earliest days of Victoria.
My name is Michelle, and I am the church historian here at Williamstown Uniting Church, Electra Street. In reflecting about the history of this church, I first wish to acknowledge the Yellowkit William people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which this church is built. We pay our respects to the elders, past, present and emerging, one land under God. And so it did come to a reflection of mine as to how we have come into this beautiful church and we have the organ still in 2024. How did it come to be that a group of Methodist people from England gave up everything to come to an unknown land with their faith, and how music was such an integral part of that faith? So this congregation here is now known as the Williamstown Uniting Church, Electra Street, but there is a rich history of development and change since 1835, which links directly to this building and organ and important events in the early Melbourne. In focusing on the organ, this information will look at people of Methodist faith, and particularly the Wesleyan Methodists, and it's important to understand the reasons why. And the reason I do this is the connection to the hardship endured, but the joy of music, of singing, from its origins of the faith of Methodists, especially the Wesleyan Methodists. Reverend John Wesley was ordained in England, in the Church of England in 1728, and with his brother Charles, ordained in 1735, formed Methodism. In 1738, only a few years later, John Wesley was actually not allowed to preach in Church of England churches. He was said, no, stay out, not to preach in the pulpit. And it was felt as if this was to do with love was being too extravagant and his methods too unorthodox. So rather than giving in and adjusting what he actually believed in his faith, he and his brother Charles left the church, the physical building of the church, and went and preached in markets, in fields, in cemeteries of all places. And there was a following that was started. And this group of people then became known as the Methodists, and which was a derogatory term at that time. And so people then said, we are Wesleyan Methodists, with pride. And his brother Charles loved music. They both loved music, but Charles was more about hymns, and he actually wrote over 6,500 hymns. And the one that you might know is Hark the Herald Angels Sing, but a number of Wesley hymns are still sung in this church today, and in a lot of other churches, Church of England, a number as well as others.
Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King.
And John really encouraged the early Methodists to sing with heart, sing with joy. And so singing was, and you have to imagine they're still singing out in the fields. They did not have a church. The land was their domain. And so you could just imagine how hard it must have been for these people to be out, but the singing was incredibly important to them, and the music from the organ. And so for the early settlers, some accounts say that it would take up to 8 months, depending on the size of the boat, to travel from England to either Sydney or Tasmania or here in Port Phillip Bay. And there are accounts noted in people's diaries of the singing of the Methodists as they were travelling. It was a great comfort to them. You can imagine the hardships. There would be cattle on board, everything that was needed on this long voyage out to a land that there were no brochures of Melbourne in that time, and so it was really sight unseen. And so it's also important to recognise that Sydney and Tasmania were founded as penal colonies, whereas Victoria was founded more to do with commercial basis. It was free settlers coming out. By 1840, Governor Burke was effectively selling land to pay for people to come out, and these were really the poor of the poorest, just to do the menial jobs to establish settlements around the bay. It is recorded that on the 24th of April 1835, John Maidment, a Reverend Orton, Mr. Thompson, and 50 Aboriginals were there on Batman's Hill for the first service conducted by an ordained minister in Melbourne. They had an organ, And it was noted that the Aborigines really enjoyed the singing and the music. And so the word spread. And so they had another service in the evening. They actually had 2 services on the one day. Early on, ministers from the Melbourne circuit wanted to start a Methodist church here. And as the years went on, they bought land in Ann Street, which runs off Nelson Place, so right in the heart of everything. And the Reverend Orton asked a young 18-year-old who came out from Tasmania, Mr. Charles Stone. He was commissioned to preach in this area. So effectively, this little cottage, or cottage I suppose you call it, was the first schoolhouse here in Williamstown for all children of all denominations. And on Sundays, a blue flag with a white cross called the Bethel flag, which means House of God, was raised, and that became the first church in Williamstown. Following that, in 1851, another chapel was built close by, and then in 1854, the first brick building here was built, and these were the founding churches. The trustees of the Wesleyan Methodist Church could see that the population was growing. There was no room to do any further expansions of the 1854 church. And they decided in faith to sell everything, and they bought this plot of land, and the first decisions were to seek tenders for the church, the Sunday school, which is now where the car park is, and the parsonage, which is still here. In between time, we had the gold rush, which was transformational to Victoria. So much gold was found, and also importantly, men went to the gold fields, and so women were left behind to take charge of just about everything, including churches. And so that included Mrs. Sutton, who was by then remarried to Mr. Mason. And so the Methodists were very generous. They either went to the gold fields to find wealth, or to preach to the people that were there. Obviously, people were coming from America, from China, all over the world, following the Californian gold rush, and it was an opportunity to seek their wealth, and some did very well. And so for the Methodists that were in the gold fields at that time, and later on, they were generous with money coming back to the church. So that gave them hope and faith to develop. But then there was a land bust. Credit was low, a lot of things were happening, and people were unemployed. And so, not unlike a number of other churches in the area, they had to scale back the original plan for this church. Originally, there was a spire. There was an organ loft, but unfortunately that had to be pushed back until 1891. Mr. A. Hick, who was a congregational member here, also a trustee, was asked to do the plans, which he did, and the plans were put out for tender, and also a builder was commissioned. But this was done in debt, in faith. At the same time, in 1891, Mr. Edwin Gaunt was the manager of a wool shed called the Alfred Wool Shed, because with all of the sheep there was a lot of processing of wool, and so he was asked to come out from England just a few years earlier to manage the machinery. This was an industrial scale workshop in processing the wool and everything else connected to that. And so we were very fortunate that he was also a trustee of this church. And in 1891, when things were not going well, he donated £300 to the church This gave confidence to other people and the trustees to say, let's go for it. Let's finish the church the way that it was designed to be, and also to include an organ, which came a few years later. So that's quite different, because a number of the research papers will say he donated £300 of the organ. It's important to note that he donated to the church, which gave other people confidence to donate to the church, which enabled all of this to be completed.
The list of church organists shows a long pedigree of musicians, typically women, who combine their faith with their talents to serve others. Every name here represents a unique story, but there are a few who stand out in particular.
The organists were incredibly important to the church because the foundation of the Methodists was faith through singing. It got them through. It's their DNA. And so that's incredibly important to them. Notable organists that come through the records, and earlier I referred to Mrs. Sutton, who was the founder of Methodism here in 1840. Her daughter Emma learned to play the organ and was a noted organ player of the harmonium in early years in Ann Street. That harmonium organ came here in the early years of the Methodist Church, and the organ and the choir were noted in the choir stalls at the front of the church prior to the building of the organ loft and the organ here. In the history room, there is a beautiful photo of a little lady with a straw hat by the name of Lily Hall, who was noted on her passing for playing the organ for 20 years. And so this little lady sitting up in this particular organ is one of the most important photos that we have here. Lily was born in 1876, coincidentally the year that this church opened. She was the first child to be baptised in this church. I would also like to pay homage to Barbara Howell, who had an intellectual disability but was a wonderful member of this congregation for over 60 years. She loved the organ. It was her passion. And so we are so blessed for Barbara that on her passing, she left a bequest to this church, which helps us to maintain the organ to this day.
Williamstown Church has persevered more than a century till this day, and is now part of the Uniting Church Australia Diocese. The Methodist musical tradition remains strong here, and you can hear it not only in the hymns of the Sunday liturgy, but in the many musicians who come here to play every year. Charity and service are very important here. The church works hard to support local causes and give back to the community however, whenever it can. A big part of this has been their beloved op shop, which has been invaluable in raising charity funds year-round. Whilst people may come and go, the organ, the church, and the memories surrounding them are here to stay, and if you listen carefully, you can hear them too.